knows a lot about all kinds of stuff. Professor Dave explains.
We've just spent several tutorials going over the history of ancient Mesopotamia, so now it's time to examine some other nearby civilizations of the same period. One of the major players in the history of the ancient Near East was the Hittite Empire, which was based in Central Asia Minor, in what is now Turkey. Our Hittite sources call this area Hatti land. The empire rose to power in the 17th century BCE in the region of Anatolia, though the Hittites themselves, who were Indo-Europeans, may originally have come from the Caucasus Mountains around 2000 BCE. We now know that they called themselves Nesili, but scholars in the 19th century identified them with the Hittites of the Bible, who are now understood to have been Neo-Hittites, formerly under Hittite rule. There are a few references in the Bible to a Hittite nation, which the Book of Kings mentions in the same breath as the Egyptians. This suggests that it is referring to a powerful kingdom, whose territory is described in the Book of Joshua as stretching from Lebanon until the great river, the river Euphrates, which means as far east as Mesopotamia. This is now understood to refer to a later Neo-Hittite kingdom. The area where the Hittites settled was already inhabited by people called Hatti and Hurrians, but the Hittites took control of it after the old Assyrian Empire, which had some colonies there, fell to an Amorite invasion in the 18th century BCE. At first, there were a number of families who controlled their own cities, like Hattusa, Zalpua, and Kanesh, which had been an Assyrian town. These cities fought one another for control until the mid-17th century, when a king named Hattusili I conquered the area around Hattusa and united the other Hittite cities under his rule. He was followed by his grandson Mursili, who launched a campaign against southern Babylonia and ejected its Amorite rulers. But rather than installing himself there, he turned to the Kassites, who were his allies, and they went on to hold the city for 450 years. He also fought the Hurrians, who lived in the mountains to the east of his territory. The actions of these kings are known to us from contemporary Hittite sources that are often described as annals, because they describe all the events of a single year and then move on to the next. These annals focus on the king's success in various battles, which he achieves because his god runs before him. They also detail the booty and captives that the king has taken. Their narrative style falls somewhere between the sort of self-congratulation typical of royal proclamations and more measured accounts that try to explain the course of past events. One of them, called the Palace Chronicle, contrasts good court officials and the rewards they receive with bad ones and how they are punished. This sort of thesis is reminiscent of the biblical Book of Kings, which describes the good ends of kings loyal to God, and the bad ones of those who ignore him. Narratives are also found at the beginning of Hittite treaties, which outline the history of the relations between the two states that are signing them, though they might also refer to the mythological past, as in the case of the Treaty of Kadesh, whose prologue says that the gods of the two countries had originally established the peace between them. The last king of this dynasty was Telepainu in the late 16th century BCE. He is best known for the document known as his proclamation, which sets down clear rules for succession in hopes of avoiding the conflicts between claimants that had broken out before he was finally recognized as king. It describes these conflicts, which included the assassination of members of the royal family, and contrasts them with the stability of the Hittite court under early kings like Hattusili and Mursili. The proclamation also sets limits on the personal authority of the king by establishing an assembly called the Pankus, which could judge even him for capital crimes, and was supposed to be consulted when decisions were made. The royal court itself consisted of a number of officials whose titles have survived. The most important of these was the Gal Mesedi, who was the chief of the king's bodyguard and therefore responsible for his personal safety. He was a member of the royal family and sometimes succeeded the king when he died. The Gal Dubsar, on the other hand, was the chief scribe and therefore the head of administration. The Gal Gestin was the head of the wine stewards, which was a position of broad authority, including military authority. There was also a system of territorial administration. The Hatti land was divided into provinces that were administered by governors, while foreign cities that had been conquered might remain independent, but as in Mesopotamia, they would become vassals that owed tribute and soldiers to their new masters. These vassals were often ruled directly by the king's sons. The proclamation also sets out the punishments for various crimes, which generally amounted to fines paid to the victim rather than physical penalties. These fines were larger if the victim was a free man, and if the offense was deliberate rather than accidental. Slaves, on the other hand, were subject to physical punishment or execution. Telepinu's system represented a change from older rules that called for capital punishment or torture, some of which remained on the books, or rather the tablets in the case of crimes like murder, and religious offenses like incest or bestiality. The size of the fines in this newer legislation was also reduced from what it had been in the past. Telepinu's reign is considered the end of the Old Kingdom, since it was followed by about 80 years of disorganization, about which we know very little due to an absence of cuneiform records. Around 1430 BCE, however, a new king named Tudalia I initiated what is now called the Hittite imperial period. He established new settlements in Anatolia, and the dynasty he founded elevated the status of Hittite kings to something more like the divinity enjoyed by Egyptian pharaohs. They also took on the role of priests, which made them more like the Ensi of Mesopotamia, and they officiated at religious festivals. Tudalia also fought with the Mitanni Empire, which in the past had been an ally of the Hittites, but was now becoming powerful in the southeast and in Syria. Another period of military weakness followed, during which Hattusa itself was attacked, but in the middle of the 14th century a new king, Suppiluliuma, conquered the Syrian coast and placed his sons in charge of it. He also allied himself with the Assyrians, who brought Mitanni under their control. This removed the threat the Mitannians had presented to the Hittites, and provided for a short time a buffer between Hittite territory and the expanding Assyrian Empire. Like other Hittite rulers, Suppiluliuma used diplomatic negotiations with the other powers of the Near East to achieve his ends, rather than relying on constant warfare. This could take the form of treaties or marriage with the other ruling families, such as when one of Suppiluliuma's sons almost married the widow of Tutankhamun in Egypt. Around 1274 BCE, however, his grandson Muwatalli fought the Egyptian army at the Battle of Kadesh, in northern Syria, which was on the Hittite trade route with Mesopotamia. Though the Hittites' closest trading partners were the Assyrians, who lived in the north, they also had dealings with Egypt and Cyprus. They often traded in metal, which was much more available in Anatolia than it was in Mesopotamia, and some scholars believe that they had begun to forge iron before the other societies in the region, which they then turned into weapons and tools. They also traded copper, silver, and bronze, and in return they received luxury goods like textiles. The durability, compactness, and high value of these commodities made them ideal for transporting across long distances, particularly because traders had no way of knowing who was going to buy their merchandise before they made the trip. The hostilities between Egypt and the Hittite Empire vanished not long after the Battle of Kadesh, because both states felt threatened by the continuing Assyrian expansion under Shalmaneser I. He had conquered the territory of Mitanni, which the Hittites had been supporting in order to protect themselves. In 1258 BCE, a new Hittite king, Hattusili III, signed a treaty with Ramesses II, the Treaty of Kadesh, which still survives, that fixed the border between them in the territory of Canaan. But despite their efforts, the Assyrians continued to expand, and Tudalia IV, who was Hattusili's son, was defeated by Tukulti-Ninurta and lost a great deal of territory. Then something unexpected happened, a wave of invasions and migrations, now referred to as the Bronze Age collapse. The Syrian coast, on which the Hittites depended, was one of the areas that was attacked, possibly by the people whom the Bible refers to several centuries later as Philistines, who had also attacked Egypt. The Hittite homeland itself was then attacked by several of its neighbors and destroyed. Along with the collapse of Mycenaean Greece, which we will discuss later in the series, the end of the Hittite Empire seems to have been the most significant event of this period. Our Hittite documents are written in cuneiform script, which was a Mesopotamian invention because of early Hittite contact with that region, and with Assyria in particular. Our oldest Hittite records are from around the 17th century BCE. Like a number of other societies, they found cuneiform useful even though their language was unrelated to either the Sumerians for which it had originally been developed, or the Semitic Akkadian spoken by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Their version of cuneiform, however, used a much smaller number of characters, and some of them were different from the set used in Assyrian texts. The Hittites used their own language not only for chronicles and treaties, but for poetry and religious hymns, such as the story of how the storm god Tarunt fought the dragon Illuyanka, and for a series of myths about Kumarbi, who was the father of the gods. On the other hand, the Akkadian language appears more often in international correspondence, such as the letters sent between the Hittite and Egyptian courts, since it was understood by both parties. It's also possible that letters between Hittite and Mycenaean kings, an example of which has survived, were delivered by messengers who were expected to translate their contents upon arrival. They were then rewritten in the local language, and letters that were part of the same correspondence seem to have been kept together in archives, because they sometimes refer to each other's details. By the time Greek historians started writing about Asia Minor in the 5th century BCE, it was occupied by a group of Greek cities in the west, as well as a number of different small nations like Lydia and Phrygia, and all of them were a part of the Persian Empire, which had taken control of the region in the 6th century. So unlike Assyria and Babylonia, the Hittites seem to have left no detectable trace other than as one of a number of Indo-European cultures that lived in the region. Let's move forward and learn about the Persian Empire next.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.